Hi guys, so as it says on the tin, 20 movie deaths that really freaked me out, all really upset me. As to why they freaked me out, so something could have made it into this video because the gore was really extreme, or maybe the victim was in a hell of a lot of pain, or maybe it's just a character who I really liked and it just really upset me when they died. There's a variety of different anecdotes, I think, in this video. A lot of these experiences I'm about to relate go back to films I watched when I was a child or a teenager. It's not as easy to upset me these days, I'd say. Some of these films on this list are not even horror films. I think it's even worse when something really upsets you in a film where you genuinely didn't expect it, because maybe it's just like a family action drama or whatever. But anyway, let's dive into it. This is not a ranking. I'm just going to take these in any old random order. So let's start with this one. Inner Space is an 80s sci-fi black comedy starring Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan, and basically this tech gets invented that can shrink people like Ant-Man, and people end up going inside a human body in like these miniaturized spaceships. There are good guys and bad guys having a war essentially inside somebody's life-size body, and at one point one of the bad guys flies his miniature spaceship down the wrong tunnel and ends up getting digested by the human body, and we just see this brief clip of like his bones in the cockpit or something like that, and it's the most disgusting thing you've ever seen. And it's like, oh my god, did that just really happen? Like, they brush over it in the movie. I think somebody says, oh god, the bad guy got digested. Right, okay, swiftly moving on. But I'm thinking to myself, that is like the most horrible way to go. I've not seen this movie in 20 years, and I still remember that scene really, really vividly. I can't even hear the word digestion now, or the word digestive biscuits, without thinking of that poor, poor bloke in Inner Space. Oh. So The Beyond is another 80s film, technically, although I didn't actually see it until I was in my 30s. It's a horror film. The plot is kind of random and slightly complicated, so I'm not even going to go into that. But there's this one scene where there's a random painter and decorator type bloke, and he suddenly falls down to the ground, paralysed for reasons I can't even remember, maybe witchcraft. And a bunch of spiders come out of somewhere, that they're big, massive tarantulas, and they just crawl all over him. And he can't do anything about it because he's paralysed. And they go to his face and just start picking his eyeballs out and his nose, and it's like, oh, it's the most icky, disgusting thing you've ever seen. I've got arachnophobia, so the last thing I wanted to see in a movie was a scene like this. Like, I watched Arachnophobia when I was a kid, and it really destroyed me. It left me unable to watch any more Spider movies. Like, every time a new Spider movie comes out, and there's been a few that have come out quite recently that have got pretty decent reputations, but I just can't watch them. So I was a little bit blindsided by this scene in The Beyond, because I didn't know it was coming, and it is just one of the most gory spectacles you could ever hope to see. Oh. I think everybody can probably pick out one death from the Saw franchise that has really affected them in some way, because it's a really violent franchise, and I know that there's a really good complex storyline tying all the Saw films together, but the series is also basically man killing man in really ingenious, painful ways. And you know what? Most of the stuff that you see in the Saw films, water off a duck's back. It doesn't affect me at all. But there's this one kill in Saw 5 that I can never get out of my mind, even when I'm going through a period of not watching the Saw films, i.e. now. I still think of this kill from time to time. Something might just trigger it, and I'll start thinking about it. So the death I'm talking about is the death of the character Strom. He's a cop, and at the end of the film, spoilers ahead by the way, he walks into this trap where it's like a steel room, and the walls start closing in on him, and he gets crushed essentially, but it takes a little while for the walls to come in, so he's got some time to realise what's about to happen to him. And I just try and imagine to myself the fear and the panic that you would go through knowing what's about to happen and having no way to stop it. I know it's all fantasy, it's not real, but still, the kill just really gets to me, that one. And it's not hard to imagine that things like this could happen in industrial settings, you know, in like large factories, places with lots of machinery and stuff. Probably people have been crushed by walls and machinery and things over time. Not quite in the same way as how Strahm gets it, but this kill, for me, it's just one of those really, really nasty things that just never leaves you, at least for me. This is one from my childhood, although I still watch Jaws 3 today. It's my favourite Jaws film, but let's not go into that. So there's this English guy, and he goes down into this dark tunnel. I'm not even sure what he's doing in the tunnel, to be honest. He's up to something. But then the shark gets him. And you know what? Even if the kill had ended here, it still would have been a really creepy sequence. But then a little bit later, we cut back to him, and he's still alive, but he's inside the shark's mouth. And he's trying to reach this grenade, I think. I don't think he thinks that he can get out. He's wedged there. So I think he's trying to just pull the pin on his grenade that he's dropped so he can end it all. But in the meantime, he's just wedged in the mouth, and I can just picture like the sharks slowly crushing his legs, and just imagine how frightening that would be to know that you're in this giant shark's mouth and you're never getting out, and like you're slowly being crushed. It's the most awful thing. I mean, this guy was a pretty cocky character, but I don't care how nasty you are in the movie up to this point, I'm still going to feel sorry for you. Like, it could be the most horrible movie character of all time in this shark's mouth, and I'm still going to really feel for whoever it is. This kill used to get cut out of Jaws 3 whenever it was on UK television in the 80s and 90s. It probably wouldn't happen now, but back in the good old censored days, I think even the TV execs figured that this would be a bit too much for audiences, so they used to take out the bit where you see him alive in the mouth. But what a kill. I mean, yes, Jaws 1 is technically a better movie, but Jaws 1 does not have any kills as nightmarish as this one in Jaws 3. This is probably the most recent film that I saw to get into this list. I only saw The Borderlands last year. Now, in order to talk about the scene that I want to talk about, I'm going to have to give huge spoilers for the end of this movie. So if you haven't seen this, I encourage you to skip ahead a minute to the next film I'm going to talk about and just not listen to what I'm about to say. Please watch The Borderlands without it being spoiled. But if you have already seen it or you don't care about spoilers, then I will press on. So at the very end of this, we've got these two guys who are crawling through these tunnels under a church, and they crawl into the next tunnel, except it's not actually a tunnel, it's the huge long mouth of some kind of demonic worm or something, and they turn around to leave because they sort of realise that where they are suddenly feels very freakish, and they can't go anywhere because I think the mouth has closed or whatever, so they're literally trapped in wherever this is. It's inside a worm of some description, and acids start coming out of the wall and melting into their arms, and the first stages of digestion have begun, and it's super, super freaky. And we don't even cut away for a while. Like, we see all the panic and terror in the first stage of this, and then eventually we sort of cut to credits. But it's one of the most awful things you could ever see in a movie. This movie is infamous for this scene. And I actually knew what was going to happen before I saw the movie, and I was still super horrified by what I saw. It wasn't even a surprise to me, and it was still like this incredible spectacle that just really freaked me out. So yeah, I've got to include this on this list. And I have noticed that so far in this video, we've had a lot of instances of people being eaten and digested, so maybe this is just a trigger for me. We'll see how the rest of the video goes. This is one that probably wouldn't affect me as much if I was seeing the film for the first time now. But the fact is, I saw this death scene back when I was 9 or 10. So, RoboCop 2, whilst not being as critically acclaimed as the first one, it's still as violent as the first one, and it's still made in the same sort of style. And there's this one death. So there's this villain called Kane, and he's got this cop on his payroll, but he thinks that the cop has betrayed him, so he has this cop knocked out and brought to him on a gurney. And then he has this corrupt doctor figure who's got all these utensils on a tray. He picks up a scalpel and just he puts the thing under the cop's chin, who's tied down to this gurney, and just starts cutting him all the way down to his groin, really slowly though. And then we cut away, and the implication is that this cop is going to die in this scene, but very slowly and painfully. And I just found it a really weird way to kill somebody, very pointless. I mean, I guess the idea is to just really make this guy suffer, but it definitely affected me, this kill. I was too young to be watching this movie, to be honest, but it's such an incidental little moment in the movie, and probably a lot of people won't even remember it by the time that they've watched the whole thing, but it stayed with me for a long, long time. In my opinion, Collateral Damage is probably the last decent Arnold Schwarzenegger action film, although this is not a debate that I'm going to get into here. If you don't know what this film is about, I'll try and be very, very brief. So it's about a fireman who goes to Colombia to try and get revenge on a drug lord because the drug lord killed his family. It's something like that. And as you can probably imagine, Arnold Schwarzenegger is playing the fireman, not the drug lord. But there's this one scene where the main villain decides to kill one of his underlings for poor performance. And so basically he straps him into a chair, and he's got this little contraption. What you do is you put it into the guy's mouth, and it lifts up, and then you can strap it in place so that the mouth is held open, and there's nothing the guy can do about it. And if you've not seen this film, you will have no idea what I'm about to say next. So the villain then gets this massive, like, boa constrictor or something, and starts feeding it into the guy's mouth, and it goes all the way in until you see the tail disappear. And I've sat there watching this play out, and I'm thinking, how in the hell did anybody come up with this, let alone pretend to film it? Suffice to say, it had an effect on me for a long, long time, and I have never looked at a snake the same way since. One thing that's always fascinated me about Egyptian history is this idea that they used to wrap people in bandages, put them in a coffin, and then just leave them to starve to death. Now, I don't know if this was something that actually happened or whether it's just a movie thing, but just the thought of it really makes my skin crawl. I mean, just imagine how scary that would be to have that done to you, just lying there in the coffin, knowing that it will never be opened up again. Well, the writers of The Mummy from 1999 clearly thought that that was not enough pain and suffering for somebody to go through. So they decided to add to that situation. So this high priest, Imhotep, at the start of this film, he is caught with his pants down with the princess who's married to the emperor or something like that. And his punishment is to be put into a coffin covered in bandages, but also they get this vase filled with killer beetles and pour them into his coffin with them as the lid is about to be shut down. And these beetles are vicious. They're not like normal beetles. They're like the beetles version of piranhas. They just gnaw away at you straight away. And Imhotep can't even see what's happening to him because bandages are over his eyes. So it's the most awful way to kill a human being. Now, I saw this in the cinema, and for the rest of the movie, even though it was a really good time, because The Mummy 1999 is really good, I was still thinking about this prologue. Like every 5 minutes there'd be a good scene, and then I'd go back to thinking about the prologue briefly, and then I'd watch another few scenes, and then I'd go back to thinking about the prologue, rinse and repeat for the rest of the movie. Even on the way home, I was still thinking about the prologue, and Even now, 26 years later, 2 sequels later, and a failed Tom Cruise reboot later, I'm still thinking about that damn prologue. So there exists a branch of horror that concerns cannibalism, and the Italians were very good at exploiting this in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. You still get some cannibal films today now and then, but there was a whole raft of them at one point, a long time ago. Things like Cannibal Holocaust, and I decided to get involved in watching them because back in my late teens, early 20s, I went through this phase where I was very brash, very arrogant. I was kind of like, I'm too cool for Halloween now, give me some Cannibal Holocaust, you know. I was ready to step up to the next level, show me the gore. But these days, of course, I know that that's just a silly way to think. You know, movies are about the quality, not the level of gore. And after a while, I realised that films like Cannibal Holocaust were not for me. Although the kill that I remember the most from that little phase that I went through is from the one that's called Ferox. So this guy is captured by these cannibals, and he's held under a table and tied so that his head is just popping up through this hole, and then they basically just cut his head off like it's a coconut or something so they can eat out of his head. And I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me, and I've never forgotten that kill. It's a kill that genuinely still upsets me even today, just when I think about it, because it's not so much the violence in these films, really. It's the complete lack of human empathy in this world. You know, it's just so dark, like human beings just completely not giving a crap about being really torturous towards other human beings. This happens in the Saw movies, but it's just next level in things like Cannibal Ferox. And yeah, I don't know precisely what age I decided to give up on these movies, but I eventually just slowly backed out of the room of it all and said bye-bye. I mean, if you enjoy things like this, absolutely fine. I'm not knocking them or anything. It's just that me personally, I've got my particular level of violence that I'm willing to go to, and then I don't like to go any further than that. Licence to Kill is by far the most violent of all the James Bond films, and there's this one kill in it which again is an example of a villain killing an underling. It's like one of those formulas in movies. If you want to show how terrifying your villain is, get him to kill one of his own people in a really extreme way. It just happens so often. And in this film we have this villain called Sanchez, and he realises that this guy Milton Crest has been backstabbing him, stealing his money. So Sanchez pushes him into this machine. I don't even know what it is. It's some kind of deep sea diving machine. I don't know what it's for, but it's on the ship. It's something to do with the air, because Sanchez does something to the controls and suddenly the air in the machine starts to change or something. I haven't a clue what this thing does, but I do know what happens to the guy inside the machine. So we start to see his head suddenly start to expand, and it just blows up like a balloon, but really slowly, and you see the look of terror on the guy's face, and then suddenly his head explodes. And when I saw this as a kid, I just found it absolutely horrifying, and what made it worse is that I just didn't even understand the science behind what had made this happen. Even today, I don't know what this machine is. Help me out in the comments if you know what the hell this guy dies in, because I have no friggin' idea what it's meant to be. But it's an utterly horrible moment. Licence to Kill is full on. It's the only James Bond film with a 15 certificate, I think. And there's another kill in this movie which is really memorable as well. Like, this guy gets slowly dropped into like a cocaine shredder or something, and that's really gory as well. Another guy gets eaten by a shark. It's the violent James Bond film. Also a very good James Bond film. I think everybody knows what I'm about to talk about here. Now, I actually really like Terrifier these days. I think 2 and 3 are excellent movies. I really enjoy both of them. But the first Terrifier, there's a kill in that film which really upsets me even today. So basically, Art the Clown hangs this woman upside down, and then cuts down through her with a saw, and it's just awful to watch. To be honest, I think I turned away when it was happening, but just the noise of it, the sound of it, just the thought of him doing that to a woman, it made me feel really queasy. And this is one of those things where it wouldn't make any difference if it was a man or a woman being hung upside down. At the end of the day, that would be so extreme to happen to you. It just doesn't even bear thinking about. And after watching this film, I felt really squirrely for like a few days. I kept thinking back to that kill, and I was like, oh my god, that's just too far, you know what I mean? And yes, in the intervening years, I have made my peace with Terrifier. I decided to brave number 2 against my better judgment, and realised that it was very easy to watch compared to the first film, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Same with number 3. Whether I will ever go back to number 1, I don't know, because just thinking about that kill, even years after watching it now, it's like, my god, it just really got to me. So, as you might be able to tell from the subtle change of light and my change of t-shirt, I am back on a separate day to finish this thing off. We still have 10 deaths to go at this point. Now, these next 2 films I'm going to talk about, they're both similar in that they contain deaths that are complete accidents, and you'd never think it was possible for people to die in this way, and that's what makes them both super freaky to me. So this first one is from a Hugh Grant film called Extreme Measures, a fairly forgettable thriller from about 96, I think. It is a good film, although I've not seen it since I first watched it all those decades ago. But there's one moment in it which has never left a small part of my gut for like almost 3 decades. So there's an FBI agent. He's either an FBI guy or a cop, and he chases Hugh Grant into a train tunnel. But it's not one of those really thin tunnels. It's like a big, wide tunnel near an inner city station. So there's like 8 or 9 tracks all running parallel to each other. So the agent probably feels quite safe going into these tunnels, because if a train comes, then you've got loads of space to jump out of the way. But just randomly, the rails switch because somebody at the station, an operator, has moved the tracks, because the train coming in, it needs to come in on a separate track. And when the rails move places, it just wedges this guy's leg against another rail, and he can't move. He's completely immobilized. There's an oncoming train, and I'd say he's got about 30 seconds to realise that he's going to die in an extremely horrible way, and it's just unthinkable to think what somebody would think of in that situation, completely out of the blue. You just wouldn't expect it. I was always brought up to believe that you should never go on train tracks, but mainly because of the electrocution possibility. I don't think I've ever considered that the rails might subtly shift and wedge your leg, as is what happens in this film. So yeah, it's an awful fate for this one character, and I've never forgotten it. So here's that other accident type kill I promised you. This is from another 90s film, Stakeout. I've not seen this since the 90s. Does anybody still watch Stakeout these days? Probably not. But at the end of the film, there's a chase of sorts between the good guys and the bad guys, and one of the bad guys falls over the side of a pier or something, off a promenade maybe. It's in like a little industrial area, and he lands on some logs which are in the water, some big thick timber logs that are all lined up next to each other in the water. And at first you think he's alright. He lands on the logs on his back, but he hasn't fallen that far. I mean, I'm still thinking at this point that the good guy might sort of aim down and shoot him on the logs, sort of a thing. But then what happens next is the logs sort of move apart slightly in the water so that he falls into the water, and then he tries to scramble back up, but the logs just keep rolling, so he can't get any purchase, and he drops back down again. And then the logs just bob back into the same position that they were originally, and he's under the logs and he can't get out, so I think he drowns. I think that's how it plays out. I've not seen it in a long, long time, but I remember this really freaked me out, because I just thought, oh my god, I never would have predicted that he would die in that situation. I mean, that is just a death trap waiting to happen, and you'd probably not even realise it if you were just stood quite close to the logs just looking at these things. And I've thought about the science of this kill quite a lot in the intervening years. It's just something that pops into my brain every now and again, but it's definitely a kill I will never forget. Speaking of dangerous waterlogs that really freak me out in movies, there's also that waterlog from Caddyshack, but given that nobody dies in that sequence, I can't include it in the video today. You probably think I'm going to talk about Captain Rhodes. Well, you would be 100% dead wrong, because the kill I actually want to talk about involves one of his buddies back in the tunnels. So there comes a point in this where this giant platform lowers down with like hundreds of zombies on it, and everybody left in the complex is basically screwed. And Rhodes abandons his buddies because he's such a nice guy, and these buddies of his just start running around like headless chickens. Like, they just completely lose their heads. They lose all sense of direction. They completely freak out. I mean, it's understandable in the circumstances, I suppose, but there's two of them who, they just get encircled by the zombies in different situations, and this one guy, he realises he's had it. I mean, you can just see by the look on his face, he knows that he's about to get eaten alive, and there's nothing he can do about it at this point. And he starts making these like childlike noises of some description. I can't remember exactly what he does, just that he does it. And it's a brilliant choice by the actor, because it just really amplifies his terror to the point even I'm feeling it. Even I'm feeling slightly upset for this guy, even though he's been nothing short of a twat, just like his boss, for the entire movie. But on a human level, I just feel horrified for him. And, you know, he starts getting eaten, and we see some gory details of that, but it's such a bad fate. This entire movie is so black. From the minute that Day of the Dead starts, I just feel like my soul has gone to a very dark place, because the tone of this movie is something else. But very impressed with what Romero managed to do with this on such a restricted budget and a script that was completely butchered. But yeah, it is very, very bleak as a movie, and it's never more bleak than when this particular guy who I've been talking about is dying at the hands of the zombies. It's horrific. Next we have Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, everybody knows that censorship used to be a much more prevalent thing in the film industry than it is nowadays. These days you can do what you like, just have as much gore and violence as you want, and nobody cares one bit. But back in the old days, it was a lot different. You know, it was extremely difficult for certain cuts of movies to get approved, whether it was an 18 or 15. There were all sorts of problems that filmmakers had to overcome when it came to like the classification boards and whatever. And yet, it's incredible how many PGs and 12s from the 80s and 90s contain these over-the-top gore moments where you just think to yourself, how on earth did they get this stuff past, especially from that age of cinema? And this is a case in point. Raiders of the Lost Ark is absolutely a case in point, because at the end of this film, all the villains suffer this really horrible fate, and we get to see it square in the eyes. There's no shying away from it. So everybody knows the end of this film. Ghosts come out of the Ark, and people's heads start exploding, and the Nazis have all these bolts of lightning going through them. But the one that really has always got me is the Gestapo guy with the glasses, whose face just sort of melts. Like, you see his glasses move and his skull coming apart, and there's red blood, and he's doing this scream that's like, ah! The same sort of scream that you can imagine being on his face if he was torturing somebody back in Germany. But it's awful what you watch happen to this guy. It's like something that you'd see in The Evil Dead, worse. And they play this on a Saturday afternoon. It's like, oh, the ITV movie for this afternoon, Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's just crazy to me. I can't help wondering whether kids these days would be affected by this as I was back when I used to watch Raiders in the 80s. But by God, this death always used to stick with me. This is one that probably not a lot of you are familiar with, because A, it's not a very well-known film, and B, it's not even a horror film, and this is a horror channel. Twin Town is a black comedy, I think, and I'm still slightly surprised that I even watched it. I think what happened is, I think I bought some kind of DVD multi-pack for some reason that had a particular film that I wanted to see, and Twin Town just happened to be in this multi-pack, even though I didn't really want the film. And one night I just threw it on because I owned it, and I watched the whole thing. It's not a bad film, but it's not my sort of thing, really. But there's this one death that happens towards the end of it, which really affected me. So there's this local drug dealer in Wales. He's played by an actor whose name I can't remember, but he was the villain in Mission Impossible 2, a Scottish actor. I just can't think what he's called. But I think this was one of his earlier parts when he was still making his way in the acting game. But his fate at the end of this film is awful. So he's at his flat, and these two twins, they go round his house, and when he answers the door, they knock him out. And they bundle him in a car, presumably, and they take him out to the ocean, and they put him on a boat, and then they strap him down to the top of this coffin so that he's on top of the coffin. They duct tape his mouth, and he's completely tied down, nothing he can do, and then they calmly take the boat out into the middle of the ocean. And while this is happening, I'm thinking, okay, well, something's going to happen here that's meant to be like exciting. You know, he'll burst free or something, and there'll be like a scuffle, and then they'll kill him, maybe. But no, nothing like that happens. They literally just get into the middle of the ocean, and then they calmly just stand up with no discussion, no drama. They literally pick the coffin up from both ends and just casually slide it down into the water. The villain's face throughout all this, he's got his mouth taped up, but his eyes are bulging. He's like, what the hell is going on? Because he knows these two twins quite well, and they're not really the murdering types. They're just a couple of oafs from the local area, and yet suddenly they're acting like cold-blooded killers at the end of this film, and it's just so weird. This guy is so shocked by what's going on. I'm shocked by what's going on. And the coffin just bobs slightly in the water and then just sinks, and you just see this villain's face like in sheer disbelief as his head just disappears down into the ocean, and that's it. And I was just utterly stunned by this. And the kill is not massively justified. I mean, this drug dealer, he wasn't a nice guy, but the act that he committed against these two twins, so I think he killed his granddad, their granddad, but not in a murdering sort of way. It was kind of an accident. He'd meant to just annoy this granddad by killing his dog or something like that, but he accidentally caused an explosion which killed the granddad. And yet the rebuttal from these twins is really vicious. Just to spend all that time taking him out to the ocean, because it must have been like an hour between when they knocked him out and when they get into the middle of the sea, and then to just give the guy that horrible death where, you know, he slowly realises he's just going to be left to sink to the bottom and there's nothing he can do about it. Or he's not even given the chance to speak for himself because his mouth's duct taped the whole time. That death just really upset me on a human level. It just really got to me a little bit. And I've not seen the movie since that one time I watched it back in the noughties, but this whole scenario that I've described, yeah, it's always stuck with me. So I'm sure you know where I'm going with this one. Spoilers ahead, by the way, if you haven't seen No Time to Die, which was the most recent and final Daniel Craig James Bond film. Now, I was very excited about watching this film because it was the first one for my oldest son, who I believe was 10 at the time. He'd seen quite a few Bond films at home, but this was to be his first cinematic experience of James Bond. My wife was coming along as well. It was a bit of a family outing on a Saturday afternoon, and none of us had been spoiled by the movie. I had been deliberately avoiding online information about the film. I was being very disciplined about that. So when I walked into the cinema, I knew nothing, and I was very proud of myself for putting myself in that situation. I could just enjoy the movie without spoilers, and as far as I'm aware, my son and my wife had no idea what was coming as well. So imagine our shock at the end of the film when they kill off James Bond. It was the most stunning moment of disbelief in the cinema seats you could imagine. I was just kind of like, I was like Zorin at the end of A View to a Kill. I was just like, Mayday. Like I just could not believe it, honestly. I felt myself welling up. I mean, I'm a huge James Bond fan, have been my entire life. Like, I've spent 40 years living with this character, enjoying this character in all those movies. He's such a dependable person for me, and to have him killed off is just something I never thought I would ever see. When we came out of the cinema, we went into this supermarket nearby just to get a quick snack, and even when I was walking around the aisles, I could still feel the tears behind my eyes. I was trying to hold it together because I didn't want to like cry in front of my son and my wife, but it was difficult. I really struggled to keep the emotion in. And you know what, from an artistic point of view, I don't necessarily disagree with what they did. I mean, I still would have let the character have a happy ending personally, but okay, they did what they did, fine. And you know what, I watched the film a second time when it came out on 4K. I made sure that it was only me in the house when I did, because I didn't want to put the others through it again. I watched it a second time, and I did enjoy it. And I sort of started to come to terms with it a bit. But you know what, that ending, it still affected me just as much, almost, the second time around. I could still feel the tears building behind my eyes. I don't think they came out, but it was still upsetting to me, even like 6 months later, when I'd had a load of time to get used to the fact that it had happened. This death definitely falls into the random accident category that has popped up now and again in this video. So in the first Lethal Weapon film, Riggs and Murtaugh go round this drug dealer's house, and there's a swimming pool there that has this tarpaulin sheet covering it. I don't know why it's there. Maybe it's to keep out the rainwater. Maybe. I've no idea. Nobody in the film comments on the fact that the swimming pool is covered, but Riggs shoots a bad guy in the chest, and he falls into the tarpaulin, and suddenly the thing wraps around the guy, and he can't get out. He's just trapped in this sheet. He can't resurface. Now, there's a chance that he might have died from the gunshot wound anyway. That is unconfirmed. But given that he's wriggling around inside this sheet, we have to presume that there's a strong chance that he could have survived had the sheet not been covering the swimming pool. And I just think to myself, did nobody think that this was a dangerous thing to have covering a swimming pool? Because even if somebody had just been walking around the pool and slipped and fallen in, then they would have died. Surely the sheet would have come off the sides exactly the same way, wrapped that person up, and they would be a dead person. I've never seen a sheet like this on a swimming pool in any other situation my entire life, apart from in this one scene in this movie. So I do wonder if people looked at this film and thought, oh, that's a really crappy idea, let's not do that. Maybe, I don't know. But I've always remembered this scene, and I always used to think that is such a dangerous thing, and that is what could happen if you do that. So yeah, this one definitely stuck with me for sure. King Solomon's Mines is an Indiana Jones rip-off from the 80s that just so happens to be a lot of fun, actually. But there's this one scene which is really scary, and it's never left me. And this is another example of my arachnophobia having a big effect on me. So I think this is towards the end of the film. The action has moved to some large cave network, and one of the villains sends one of his minions down this tunnel just to explore it and check it out and see if the good guys are hiding down there. And this guy, he goes down this thin tunnel, and he comes across this huge giant spider, like ridiculously huge. It's massive. It could never exist in real life. It's ludicrously big, and there's webs in the tunnels, and this guy, he gets like stuck in this web, and suddenly the spider is coming up from like behind him or whatever, and he's done for, and you just see the terror in his face. And then we switch scenes, and that's the last we see of him or the spider. As far as I'm aware, the spider survives the movie. I can't remember if these caves all topple and end up collapsing. Maybe they do. I just know that we never see the spider gets killed, so as far as I'm concerned, it's still out there, you know what I mean? And I can remember going to school and talking about this spider with like at least one other kid, because he was freaked out about it as well. It was just awful to watch. Now, similar to Jaws 3 that I was talking about earlier on in the video, this scene was actually taken out of the film when King Solomon's Mines was on TV sometimes, because there was at least once where I was watching this and I was looking out for the spider scene and it wasn't there. So this is one of those. Sometimes they just didn't include it. But yeah, this one's one that has definitely had an effect on me. I haven't seen the film in a while, but God, I've never forgotten that scene. If this video had been a ranking, I think this one might have made it into like the top 3. I've sort of deliberately left this one until last because it's kind of a 2 for the price of 1. Like, yeah, there's literally 2 deaths in this film, which really upset me. The Fly 2 is not a particularly good movie. It doesn't really have anything interesting to add to the story of the first one, and the whole thing is just kind of nasty, in my opinion. So one of the deaths, there's like this mercenary who gets his head crushed in an elevator, and you just see his head like exploding like a grapefruit. It's kind of brief, but oh, it's icky. And fair enough, I was watching this movie way too young. I was probably like 9 or 10, but it really gave me nightmares, that guy in the elevator shaft. And I've had a kind of fear of elevators ever since, to be honest. It doesn't help when you get something like what you see in Resident Evil 1, where the woman's head comes off as the elevator goes down. I'm always very careful around elevators and machinery these days, take it from me. But there's another death in The Fly 2, which is horrible. So at the end of the film, the main villain, I can't remember the circumstances in which it happens, but he basically gets changed into a kind of Brundlefly abomination, and you just see him crawl into his new cell. And the implication is that he's going to be there for a long time until he dies. I don't think they've got any intention of killing him. I mean, who knows what's going to happen after the story's finished, but he could end up being there for a long time, just suffering and having to exist as this freaky thing. And I'm thinking, this is just too much. Like, this is literally upsetting. I don't want to see a human being suffering this much. I mean, has this guy been that bad during the movie up to this point? Yes, he's basically an all-purpose like corporate villain who cares more about money than people's feelings. But to give him this fate, really, it's a bit much. It's like I felt kind of upset at the end of this film. I mean, I was too young to be watching it, but still, I just think The Fly 2 is really, really cruel, unnecessarily so. So there we have it, 20 movie deaths that either freaked me out or upset me. I do feel like I've really bared my soul to you in this video. And by all means, drop some examples in the comments of movie deaths that have really freaked you out. I'd be curious to hear about them. But for now, I will wrap up and bid you all farewell. So, farewell.